the Georgy Toloraya. He's so famous, because he's a scholar turned diplomat turned scholar. Now he's a chair of a regional program of Ruski Mir Foundation. It's like a Korea foundation, and he was a consul general, a Russian consul general to Sydney, and he was the director general of Asian Department of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and he has been to Pyongyang twice as a diplomat, and also he visits Pyongyang all the time. Therefore, I would say that he's not one of the most expert in Russian-North Korean relations, and also he knows Koreans, and his wife teaches in Korea too. And Hankuk University of Foreign Studies, right?
She terminated, but she was there for several years now.
Now she's in Moscow?
She's in Moscow.
Oh, now you're living with her now?
No.
At last.
She's teaching in MGIMO now.
No, MGIMO. He's a graduate of MGIMO. It's like a diplomatic academy, right? It's a different one.
Well, it's a full-scale university, one of the most prestigious in Russia, which one of the main missions is to train diplomats. But it also the people go to business, to go to government.
Yeah, I have seen all the officials from foreign ministry. Most of them are from MGIMO, not Moscow State University. And with this brief introduction, let us start.
Okay, thank you, Shannon. It's a pleasure to be here and for something like a very impromptu visit. I'm here for an embassy function as a chair of regional programs of the Ruski Mir Foundation. But as was mentioned, I'm also a professor at MGIMO, and also I'm the director of Russian Strategy in Asia Center at the Academic Institute of Economy. So I'm sharing my time between practical work and research, and Korea is of course the area of my interest. I don't say expertise because nobody can be real expert in Korea, but at least it's something I'm mostly interested in. And speaking about experts, when I told my friends and relatives I'm going there, and going here, that was 2 days ago. They said, "Oh, you must be crazy. There's a war on the threshold there. Where are you going?" I said, "Okay, if there'll be the war, then you can write on my tombstone, I was a bad expert. That didn't predict it." So anyway, but the situation is really tense and worrisome, and I think that I should first put the Korean issue into more of the Russian foreign policy prospects and concepts. I would say that we are living in a situation of global disorder, and no one knows how the new order will look like. Well, I will repeat the usual mantra of Russian foreign policy experts that the world is moving from unipolar to multipolar or polycentric world. But, well, this is the reality. We have now several competing centers of power, which are different in their level of power, but they can compete in so far peacefully. But who knows what will turn next. Economically, the developing countries are rising. Of course, both Russia and China have the economic problems, but still the prognosis is that the countries of BRICS, for example, will be more than 50% of the world's GDP by 2030. This fuels new conflicts, and I believe that Russia's current conflict with the West, with the US now, is rooted into this not only in history, not only historic animosity between Russia and the West, but also in these new tendencies. And I would say that in Russia there's a rise in nationalism and the code word of sovereignty, and therefore actually the support Putin, the genuine support of President Putin, who puts this sovereignty and independence issue on his banner, is very high. There is a small liberal position, but it's not influential. And well, maybe 80% of population supports Putin, and we have the election on the 18th of March next year. If Putin runs, it's not yet officially declared. I presume he'll get somewhere like 70%, generally without any, doctorship of the votes. So this is the reality. And Russia has declared several years ago the turn to the East policy, although we, the Asian experts, have suggested from the start of 1990s that should be one of the Russia's priority. But at the time, the Russian foreign policy was concentrated on building relations with Europe, the US, and countries like China were, well, of the secondary importance. It all changed with the advent of the new century, and especially after the Ukrainian crisis and Crimean crisis. Russia's relation with the West have considerably deteriorated. So therefore, we had nothing to do but turn to the East. We had to implement this policy, which was declared but not followed. Now we just had no other choice. But in Russia's conditions, that turned to be a little bit one-sided. Most of the turn to the East is oriented on China. China began dominant in foreign economic relations, in foreign policy as a partner, in security issues. And I would tell you frankly that not everybody is completely happy with that in Moscow, and especially in the Far Eastern areas. Because we feel that the China, of course, is number one, but still you cannot put all eggs in one basket. Well, all the relations with China, however important it is, shouldn't overshadow relationship with other countries and regional organizations. So therefore, recently we are trying to build up the Eurasian Economic Union, which consists of Russia and several former republics, and built a partnership both with China in the framework of so-called Great Eurasian Partnership and Southeast Asian countries like ASEAN countries. We still don't have much of cooperation with Japan, although under Prime Minister Abe there are attempts to somehow soften the issue of territorial dispute. And I'm not sure how it will work out, because Mr. Abe was very active, and he introduced a plan, economic cooperation plan in Russia, in exchange for some softening of positions on the islands of the territorial issue. And what has naturally been more or less agreed on, that these four islands should be developed as a sort of joint development area, whatever this means, and nobody still doesn't know what this means. Now the tricky issue is the law, the legislation which will be used in this area, because if it's Russian legislation, it's not acceptable to Japan. It cannot be Japanese legislation. It means there's some kind of special legislation needed, and no one knows how to do it. So this rapprochement with Japan has its limits, and we fully understand that the main motive for Japan to do this is to try to not to allow the appearance of anti-Japanese Russia-Chinese alliance. China is the main factor. But well, everybody must be aware that, of course, Russia won't sacrifice its relation with China. And for example, Putin's relation with Xi Jinping for the better relation with Abe, who will be changed in a couple of years. So our long-term interests dictate that Japan cannot be the real balancer in Russian foreign policies. So where does Korea come here? Well, I may be a little bit Korea biased, but I often call that that Korean Peninsula is a sort of key for Russia, for the whole of Asia and the Pacific, because this is a neighboring area with great economic potential, and it can be used as a gate to the Asia and the Pacific economically, and play much more secure, more important role in security. But for one thing you all know about, and this is a thing is called North Korea. And speaking about this gate or key comparisons, I call North Korea a closed door of Russia to the Asia and the Pacific, because this is the only place where our land borders meet. China, we have a long road with China, but China is a continental power. Well, I don't mention Mongolia, of course. So, well, the Korea can be a real bridge, but it's not the situation now. And Korea these days I think in a bit of precarious situation, because it's yet again fallen that what I would call maybe a revenge of geopolitics. Yet once again, Korea can become the shrimp amongst the whales, with the big power interests colliding here, and we now see that the most important issue of all is possible US-China conflict. Well, I think, I may be wrong, maybe Del will correct me, but I think that this whole exercise of aircraft carriers coming here is a sort of signal to China, a sort of strong message, I would say powerful message, that US is here to do what it's thinks right, and China must accommodate this. That unless China does something about North Korea, and that means again the North Korean nuclear program, then it might risk war at its doorstep. So this is, I wouldn't exactly call it blackmail, but sort of, well, pressure on China into more action vis-a-vis North Korea. A little bit unexpectedly for me, President Trump have chosen Korea as his #1 policy issue. I never heard about all this, Senate gathered in the White House with all the top brass, reporting about situation in Korea. I don't know which was the result of this debriefing, but anyway, it's very significant. And even judging by Russian press, which is based in itself on the American and Western press, Korea is now #1 issue, foreign policy issue. In Russia, Syria is forgotten, Ukraine is forgotten, but everybody speaks about Korea. I get dozens of, phone calls a day. Just don't pick up the phone from the correspondent, say, please explain what's going on in Korea. Is there will it be a war there? How do we see that? This idea that President Trump and President Putin will be buddies. There's not much illusions about that now in Russia, and and the strike against Syrian air base, and now also Korean issue. I think it shows the limits of future U.S.-Russia foreign policy and security cooperation. We shall see, of course, how this current crisis will be solved. But anyway, if somebody had some illusions in Moscow, I think there are none these days. How do we see this current crisis? Officially, several times we criticized these military maneuvers and military exercises, and said that it is a dangerous exercise. And although Russia is, of course, against North Korean nuclear program, we feel that sanctions and pressure doesn't help. What do we mean by that? We don't exclude pressure. We don't exclude sanctions against somebody who's breaking the rules. And North Korea obviously is breaking them, at least in a nuclear program. I wouldn't be so categorical concerning the missile program, because the resolutions of the United Nations Security Council, which prohibit ballistic missile launches, actually cannot overrule the basic international law documents like the Treaty on the Space of 1967, which gives all the countries the right to develop their space exploration. Well, of course, it's very nuanced, but if we're categorically against nuclear program, which is a violation of NPT and all the security regimes, we're not so categorical against missiles. And if you look at the Russian press attentively, you won't see that these nuclear and missile programs are put on the same bar. It's a bit different. But anyway, we do feel that the current missile launches and the North Korean efforts to acquire the ICBM capability, actually the second strike capability against US, is also a dangerous game. And that is should be stopped. The difference between us is on the methods. There's been a long-standing argument between Russia and South Korea on what should be the methods of tackling North Korean nuclear program. During the last presidency of Park Geun-hye, we didn't see eye to eye at all. For one thing, previous South Korean administration saw the imminent collapse of North Korea as a sort of a base for its practical policy, or at least that's what we were told. And we did not believe in imminent collapse of North Korea. I've spent enough time in North Korea, and Chonin is right. I travel there from time to time. I've been there in September last year, and I'm no fan of North Korean regime. Please understand me. But I see that this country is changing, and so far it's changing in a what I would call healthy way. Economy is rising, and economy is rising on the basis of marketization. The standard of living is rising, and especially, of course, of the middle class in Pyongyang. It's not the whole of the country, but in any country which is poor, first you have rich men in poor country, then you have the whole standard of living rising. You had the same here in Korea. North Korean regime isn't going to disappear anywhere. One thing that's I think is not quite understood, that North Korean population won't rebel against this regime, probably because they fully understand that that would be the end of the state, and no one knows what comes next. So most of the population is actually got used to the system and afraid of changes, well, of drastic changes that a unification may bring. Especially the middle class I mentioned, which is most influential, became the actual support of the regime. Although, well, normally the intellectuals and the successful people wouldn't like an authoritarian rule, but in North Korean case, they see that their comparative successes life is based on their connection to the regime. And if regime disappears, they'll be on out of all of the privileges they have. If South Koreans would come, they'll be just second-rate citizens for South Korean masters, and that troubles these people. Also, there's also illusions that the problem is Kim Jong-un. That if Kim Jong-un is changed for some other leader, then the country could be more rational. I would say that North Korea is not a family dictatorship, as many people, many journalists call it. It's a sort of aristocratic republic. It's an aristocracy, where this country is ruled by a group of third, fourth generation aristocrats, the descendants of those who liberated Korea, who fought in the guerrilla war and was with Kim Il-sung in early stages of his construction of this country, and they're not going anywhere. Even if the king can be changed, there'll be another king, but the system will stay, simply because they don't have any exit strategy. Unlike in former Soviet Union or China, for that matter, or even Romania and other socialist countries, those who are now in power has absolutely no hopes to integrate themselves into a new reality if some kind of coup d'etat would occur. It's not like in Soviet Union when the party officials became the successful oligarchs, especially the younger one, like young Communist League Komsomol officials. They all got very good lucrative businesses. North Korean aristocrats cannot hope that their children would inherit their wealth and live happily abroad, for example, in Swiss or anywhere else. So they really don't have any exit strategy, and they will have to keep to their place. They have to fight. They don't want any kind of danger to their rule. So therefore, I'm explaining this to try to make you understand Russian attitude to this regime. We don't like it, but it exists. And there's no other partner in North Korea. And this partner is here to stay. Of course, there is a number of Russian experts, as well as in the West, but that year after year predicts that, okay, this year North Korea will collapse. If not this year, maybe next year. But, it's been 30 years with this kind of prognosis. North Korea is still here. And for practical reasons, we have to proceed from the presumption that this regime is here to stay, and we have nobody else to interact with in this area. Therefore, Russia wants to maintain good relations with North Korean leadership. We want to have regular contacts, and we want to try to be able to, not to persuade them, to explain what we like and what we don't like about their behavior. But unfortunately, the current sanctions and crisis have severely diminished our ability to interact with North Koreans. Kim Jong-un didn't come for the celebration of victory in 2015, although he was invited. And there's not much more contacts after that. Actually, now the contacts are most limited to some of our minority parties, like the communists, like the Liberal Democrats. They're parliamentary parties, but they are not exactly can be considered the political leadership of Russia. Also, our economic relations have come to almost zero. There was a number of projects which were discussed in 2012, 2015, well, based on a very pragmatic model of North Korean resources in exchange for Russia's investment into infrastructure and developing these resources. But with the sanctions, with the virtual stop of all the financial transactions, this is no longer possible. All these projects have stopped. We have some trade, but you shouldn't believe in figures. You can see somewhere in the press of the direct trade, custom statistics trade, because it does not cover the real trade through third countries, mostly through China, but not only through China, which some people estimate to be, well, about $1 billion, which is not that much, not that small for North Korea. And actually, the only working project now is the Rajin-Hassan Railroad project, where we had invested, and we invested hoping for the future land bridge from South Korea to Europe, and we hope at least that the South Korean containers will be transported via this link, but it never happened. I can tell you a little bit more about this process and our hopes later, but now I will continue discussing our relations. With North Korea, also, of course, our influence is limited. But the problem is that China have much more influence, economic influence and leverages on North Korea than we do. But they actually still cannot do anything about North Korea. And for Russia, we have some kind of window opportunity because we seen in North Korea as a maybe least deplorable of all foreigners. All foreigners are, suspicious and enemies, but Russians may be the least hostile of all. We have some leverage if we maintain good and respectful contacts to explain, to share some views, and to be what I call a neutral observer, if not intermediary. Intermediary is a bad one because North Koreans don't like any intermediaries. We just can help them have the stage, but not actually meddle into their direct contacts with anybody. What can we expect now? I do hope that this current crisis stage will end soon, that the ships will safely go away, and President Trump will declare victory, that he prevented Kim Jong-un from testing the nuclear bomb. And this is a victory because Kim Jong-un got frightened, Chinese got frightened, so the mission is accomplished. I hope that will be the case, and there will be no kinetic action here. If somebody disagrees, I would like to hear your opinion. But what's next? Still, I believe that talking to North Korea is the only alternative way which has been tried sincerely for years, and this is what we should strive at. Because if I talk about the U.S. and South Korean policy for years, if not decades, it's been that of strategic patience, meaning that A, North Korean regime will collapse, so B, we have to wait and isolate and help it collapse. No positive agenda. Maybe it's time to try another agenda now. I say I have no illusions about North Korea and regime, but they do have some legal interests. They do have some legal concerns, and why not address it? And maybe Mr. Trump, with what is called transactionalist approach, could after this pressure phase ends, maybe it would be possible to find some kind of channels of dialogue and at least to talk to each other and find which interests can be combined. Another factor is South Korean election. Liberal administration, probably Mr. Moon Jae-in's administration, is almost certain to come to power in 2 weeks from now. Although sometimes I think that if there's a small military conflict here, the curfew can be imposed and election can be postponed. I hope that doesn't happen. Moon Jae-in comes to power, and he has declared that his line towards North Korea and China would be at least much more, I would call, realistic. Of course, any South Korean president, any president is not free in his actions, and he cannot always follow his pre-election promises. But anyway, I believe that this policy will be more realistic and pragmatic. And what is important, I think, that this is a very interesting moment for South Korea, that South Korea can really take a sort of driver's seat in Korean settlement situation. Because with U.S. administration still, isn't, functioning properly, as at least the Department of State, South Korea is in a good position to have some influence over more for the U.S. to have more conciliatory and pragmatic policy. And South Korea, which opposed talks, which opposed negotiations unless North Korea denuclearizes, which is simply impossible, may now turn to a more pragmatic approach. I can mention here that saying to North Korea that unless you denuclearize, we won't talk, is just another way of saying we won't talk at all. Because there's no way they can denounce their nuclear weapons once it's created. That's the reality of life. And we may try to find the hard way that we cannot eliminate it by military means, by options of kinetic action. So there should be some other way. Last year, I would suggest that the most pragmatic approach is trying to freeze North Korean nuclear and missile program. To have a moratorium for nuclear tests and missile launches, at least for the time of the talks, and then see what happens. And as I've said many times, this Korean issue is the one where the process may be more important than the result. While you talk, while you have some cooperation, there's a freeze, there's sort of stability. Of course, North Korea shouldn't be led to use this pause for development, for the progression of their nuclear potential, but they do so anyway. This is what I would have suggested last year, especially when first North Korea and China, in the name of money, the foreign ministers have suggested much the same thing. But I'm not so sure today. I believe that North Koreans are about to finish creation of their second strike potential, ICBM and nuclear weapons, and they won't stop right now. They would only agree to freeze after they reach this stage. And I don't really know what to do about that. We lost the time for this freeze option. Now I see through some US publications, including those people whom I never considered doves in Korean issue, that the idea of freeze is also being discussed, but it's now, I think it's harder to implement. But it's not possible unless we try. And I still a believer into the multilateral format of dealing with North Korean issue, meaning that all the countries which are players in this game should be included into discussion and into decision making. Well, I'll be frank with you. For Russia, the six-party format is mostly desirable because otherwise we are not inside this discussion. But I think it's perfectly clear that bilateral deals just don't work. We had the Clinton letter way back in 1990s. We had all this sort of bilateral agreements. Also with South Korean participation, it just doesn't work because there's no guarantees, there's no mechanism for controlling the implementation of these agreements. And this kind of mechanism can only be created with participation of the countries like and actors like China, Russia, Japan, UN, and IA maybe. So this is the perfect mix for not only for negotiating the solution, but also for guaranteeing the solution. And I don't think that we can invent something else. However much we tried over the years, nothing else has been suggested. It's often said that North Koreans are not ready. They don't want the six-party talks. Yes, they don't want the six-party talks about denuclearization. The way it happened in the noughties in the 2000 up until 2008, but they would agree, I think, on the talks, on the diplomatic process, on the comprehensive settlement, security guarantee and settlement. And it hasn't been tried yet, and I still do believe that it's never late to try this, and now it is maybe the time to do something about it. And I would end on the optimistic note that maybe new South Korean government can take this driver's seat. Thank you.
Dan, you want to start?
Okay, you want to pick on me?
He's the gadfly of East Asia Foundation.
No, it's a great talk, and appreciate your comments. I've been thinking about it. It's a more specific, kind of narrow question. But one thing that's concerned me recently is the North Korean nuclear